At precisely 6 p.m. on September 17th, the state of Florida is set to carry out the execution of David Joseph Pittman, a 63-year-old man whose name has been etched into the state's long and violent history of capital punishment. His fate was sealed once more after Governor Ron DeSantis signed the official death warrant, bringing closure to a case that began more than 3 decades ago. In 1991, Pittman was convicted of one of the most chilling crimes Polk County had ever witnessed: the stabbing deaths of his estranged wife's parents and younger sister in the midst of a bitter divorce battle. This execution holds weight far beyond Pittman's personal story. It marks Florida's 10th execution of the year, the 12th death warrant issued in 2025, and a continuation of the state's record-breaking pace of capital punishment. The reason they were killed was not random, nor was it the result of a robbery gone wrong. The slaughter inside the Gantz household was born of something far more personal: rage, humiliation, and vengeance. At the center of this tragedy stood their estranged son-in-law, David Joseph Pittman, a man whose marriage had collapsed under the weight of bitterness and resentment. His relationship with the Gantz's daughter had deteriorated into hostility, and divorce proceedings had ripped apart whatever fragile peace remained. Pittman believed the Gantz family had orchestrated his downfall, that they had turned his wife against him and stripped him of both his pride and his future. When officers first entered the Gantz home in Bartow, they were confronted with a nightmare. Blood pooled across the carpet, furniture was overturned, and the victims lay where they had fallen in their final moments. Detectives immediately recognized that this was no random home invasion. The violence was too personal, too deliberate. Whoever had committed these murders had not come to steal valuables or escape unnoticed. They had come with one purpose: revenge. The investigation began with the obvious questions. Who would want the Gantz family dead? Detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, and extended relatives, and one name surfaced almost immediately: David Joseph Pittman. The estranged son-in-law had been spiraling. In the weeks before the murders, witnesses described him as unstable, consumed by anger toward his wife's family. He had been overheard making threats, and his bitterness during the divorce was no secret. To investigators, Pittman fit the profile of someone with both motive and opportunity. Physical evidence quickly reinforced those suspicions. Forensic teams discovered footprints and other indicators that pointed to Pittman's presence inside the home that night. There was no forced entry consistent with a stranger breaking in, which suggested the killer knew the victims and their routines. Detectives also traced Pittman's movements and found witnesses who had seen him near the Gantz residence shortly before the murders took place. Each piece of evidence was another thread tightening around him. As the pressure mounted, police brought Pittman in for questioning. Sitting across from detectives, he denied everything. He claimed he had no involvement, no knowledge of the killings, but investigators could see the cracks forming in his story. His alibi didn't hold. His explanations were vague, contradictory, and unconvincing. The more he tried to distance himself, the more his anger showed through. Detectives knew they had their man, they just needed to solidify the case. What truly sealed Pittman's fate was the combination of forensic detail and his own behavior. The crime scene was laced with the kind of fury that only someone close to the victims could unleash, and Pittman's history of threats, his erratic state of mind, and his proximity to the home that night gave prosecutors all they needed to push forward. Within weeks, Pittman was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the Gantz family's surviving relatives. His arrest was both a relief and a bitter reminder of what they had lost. Justice was beginning to take shape, but no amount of evidence, no courtroom trial, could erase the images of what had happened in that house. For detectives, the case became a textbook example of how rage can blind a killer to the mistakes that ultimately lead to their capture. Pittman thought he had exacted vengeance, but what he had really done was write his own death warrant with every move he made. By the spring of 1991, the quiet community of Bartow, Florida, had turned its eyes toward the courthouse. The murders of Bob and Lillian Gantz and their daughter Sherry Booth had shattered not only one family, but the entire town. Now, the man accused of the brutal killings, David Joseph Pittman, was about to stand trial. For the victims' relatives, it was a chance to see justice delivered. For Pittman, it was his last hope of escaping the ultimate punishment. The prosecution wasted no time in building its case. They painted Pittman as a man consumed by rage, unwilling to accept the collapse of his marriage. In their telling, he wasn't just lashing out in the heat of the moment. He had acted with purpose, with intent, and with a chilling determination to make the Gans family suffer. They introduced evidence placing him near the crime scene, and forensic findings that linked him to the house. Most damning, however, were the stories from friends and neighbors who recalled Pittman's angry threats. In the weeks before the murders, each testimony added weight to the picture of a man spiraling out of control, driven to the brink by his own pride. The defense fought to counter this narrative, trying to shift focus onto the weaknesses in the investigation. They argued there was no clear eyewitness, no definitive proof that Pittman alone had committed the killings. At times, they hinted that the case was built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Yet, as the trial unfolded, the brutality of the crime overshadowed these arguments. The sheer savagery of the attacks suggested more than a passing altercation. It suggested deep hatred, and that hatred fit only one man, David Pittman. As the trial neared its end, jurors sat in silence as photographs of the crime scene were shown. The images were haunting, and the courtroom felt the weight of every detail. It was not just the deaths of 3 people they were considering, but the sheer inhumanity of the way those deaths had been delivered. The prosecution argued this was exactly why Pittman deserved the harshest penalty available, death. After deliberating, the jury returned with its decision guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was read aloud, and the air in the courtroom grew heavy. Some family members wept quietly, others clutched each other for strength. Pittman sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the reality of his fate closed in. The judge then delivered the sentence. With deliberate words, he declared that the brutality of the crime left no other option but the death penalty. Pittman was to be executed by the state of Florida. In that moment, the path of his life shifted forever. What had begun as rage inside a broken marriage now ended with a condemned man being led away in shackles, bound for a future on death row. For the Gans family's survivors, the sentence was a measure of justice, but not closure. The pain of losing 3 loved ones could not be erased by a verdict, no matter how final. For the state, it was a reminder of the devastating cost of unchecked anger. And for Pittman, it marked the beginning of a long, lonely countdown toward his eventual execution. After his sentencing, David Joseph Pittman was transferred to Florida's death row, where he would spend the next 3 decades in isolation, confined to a small cell for the majority of his life. The passage of time did little to change the reality of his situation. Behind the thick walls and barred doors, Pittman faced the slow, grinding weight of justice waiting to be carried out. Day after day, he lived with the consequences of his rage, forced to confront the reality that he had destroyed the lives of 3 people who had once been his family. Prison life on death row is monotonous and cruel in its quiet. Hours stretch into days, days into years, and for Pittman, every sunrise and sunset was a reminder that he could never undo what he had done. During his time in confinement, Pittman filed appeals, hoping to challenge his conviction or delay his execution. But year after year, his efforts were met with rejection. Legal reviews confirmed the strength of the evidence against him. The witnesses, the forensic proof, the pattern of threats, and the state affirmed the original sentence. Meanwhile, the families of Bob and Lillian Gans and Sherry Booth waited, haunted by memories of that fateful night, knowing that justice had been formally recognized, even if it took decades to carry out. Finally, in 2025, after more than 35 years behind bars, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Pittman's death warrant. His execution date was set for September 17th at 6 p.m., a grim milestone marking the end of his long stay on death row. In accordance with tradition, Pittman was allowed to request a last meal and speak his final words before the lethal injection. His choices reflected the simplicity and, perhaps, resignation of a man who had lived decades facing the weight of his own guilt. For his last meal, Pittman requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pecan pie, complicated, ordinary foods that contrasted sharply with the extraordinary violence of his crime. When it came time for his final statement, Pittman's voice trembled as he faced those gathered in the execution chamber. He said, "I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I can't change the past, but I hope my death brings peace." There was no bravado, no last-minute defiance, just a quiet acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed and the inevitability of his own fate. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades spent reflecting on his actions. For the Gantz family, the apology came too late. For the state, it was the final act in a legal process that had taken more than 3 decades to complete. David Joseph Pittman's time on death row was more than a period of waiting. It was a stark, unflinching confrontation with the consequences of anger, pride, and obsession. It was a life contained in small spaces, measured in years rather than milestones, and defined by the knowledge that his actions had, irrevocably, altered countless lives. And when the needle was prepared, and the execution carried out, his story born of rage, revenge, and family betrayal came to its final, irrevocable close.